When a Hollywood star vanishes from public view, the silence rarely stays empty. It fills quickly with speculation, unease, and unanswered questions. In late 2021, that silence began to surround Jason Momoa, an actor whose image had long been built on strength, movement, and an almost mythic connection to nature. He was not just visible, he was everywhere. Red carpets, film sets, environmental summits, magazine covers. And then, abruptly, he was not. At the height of filming a billion-dollar sequel in London, Momoa stopped appearing altogether. Scheduled interviews were quietly canceled. Industry events passed without him. Online, fans noticed the absence before studios did. Rumors moved faster than confirmations. Some whispered illness. Others suggested exhaustion. A few hinted at something darker, something no press release could easily explain. What made the situation unsettling was not simply his disappearance, but the timing. This was a moment when everything in his career was supposed to be secure, controlled, and carefully managed. Behind closed gates in North London, far from the noise of premieres and applause, Momoa entered a period of isolation that would later become the center of quiet conversations among industry insiders. Officially, the explanation was simple. A positive COVID test, mandatory quarantine, temporary withdrawal. On paper, nothing seemed alarming. In reality, the separation placed a man known for constant motion into stillness, cutting him off from crews, crowds, and the physical routines that had defined his identity for decades. The residence chosen for his isolation was not modest. It was a sprawling estate set deep within one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods, surrounded by manicured land and designed for privacy so complete it bordered on disappearance. Inside, the house offered every luxury imaginable. Space, silence, comfort, and complete separation from the outside world. To most people, it would have seemed like refuge. To someone accustomed to noise, purpose, and constant engagement, it may have felt like something else entirely. At first, nothing appeared out of place. Production teams reported that Momoa remained engaged, attending virtual meetings, offering reassurances, even sharing brief glimpses of himself online. His voice sounded steady. His smile looked familiar. The delays were described as manageable. But days passed, then weeks. Messages shortened. Calls went unanswered. The confidence that usually filled his presence began to thin, replaced by gaps that no one could quite explain. Those gaps mattered because the stakes were enormous. The film he was attached to was not just another project. It carried financial expectations measured in billions and the weight of an entire franchise. Executives worried quietly. Colleagues waited. Schedules shifted. And still, behind the walls of that estate, the man at the center of it all remained unseen. Isolation has a way of magnifying what already exists beneath the surface. In moments without distraction, thoughts echo louder. For someone navigating professional pressure, personal upheaval, and global uncertainty all at once, the silence can become overwhelming. At the time, Momoa's personal life was also changing in ways the public had not yet fully absorbed. A long-standing marriage was quietly unraveling. Distance, both physical and emotional, had begun to reshape relationships that once seemed unshakable. Outside the estate, the world was still deep in a pandemic. London recorded tens of thousands of new cases daily. Fear and fatigue were everywhere. Inside, the experience was different, but no less intense. The luxury did not remove the confinement. It only disguised it. Staff maintained strict boundaries. Deliveries were left at gates. Human contact was reduced to screens and voices filtered through technology. For a man whose identity had been built on physical presence, connection to land and people, and constant creative output, the sudden stillness was not neutral. It pressed inward. What began as recovery quietly became something more complicated. Something that would only come into focus later, after the gates reopened and others stepped inside. At the time, no one spoke publicly about concern. There were no official statements, no emergency interventions, no visible crisis. Only absence. only quiet. Only the growing sense among those watching from a distance that something was happening out of view, something that could not be captured in carefully curated social media posts or polished studio updates. The story did not break when he isolated. It began to surface only after he left, only after the silence had already done its work. The story of Jason Momoa did not begin in luxury estates or studio boardrooms. Long before cameras followed his movements and audiences associated his name with gods, kings, and warriors, he lived a life shaped by contradiction. Born in Hawaii, but raised far from the islands in small-town Iowa, he grew up carrying two identities that never fully aligned. To outsiders, he looked different, sounded different, and moved through spaces where he never quite blended in. That sense of standing apart would follow him quietly for years. His early life was not marked by privilege or certainty. Raised primarily by his mother, Momoa learned independence early, but independence does not always come with stability. Friends from those years later described him as restless, athletic, creative, and deeply sensitive beneath a confident exterior. He gravitated toward movement and physical challenge, not only because he enjoyed it, but because motion gave him structure. Stillness never suited him. Silence made room for doubt. When modeling work opened the first door into entertainment, it did not come with comfort. Early success brought visibility, but not security. Casting rooms saw his appearance before his ability, and typecasting followed quickly. Roles were offered narrowly, often built on physicality alone, leaving little room to prove depth or range. Money was inconsistent, recognition fleeting. At one point, despite appearing on screen seen by millions, he struggled financially. The illusion of success masked a reality few outside the industry understood. The breakthrough that would change everything arrived suddenly and violently. The role that introduced him to the world as a force of nature also came at a cost. Fame did not ease pressure. It multiplied it. Expectations grew heavier. Schedules tightened. Privacy vanished. What audiences perceived as momentum was, for him, a constant test of endurance. Each role carried the unspoken demand to be bigger, stronger, more invincible than the last. When the tide finally turned with global superstardom, he embraced it fully. He collected motorcycles, traveled constantly, hosted gatherings filled with noise and laughter. Those close to him said he lived loudly because silence reminded him of uncertainty. He appeared approachable, grounded, unpretentious. Yet behind that image existed a man who rarely slowed down long enough to sit with himself. His personal life offered balance for time. A relationship built on shared values, creativity, and mutual respect gave him something steady amid chaos. Together, they presented an image of harmony that contrasted with the volatility of celebrity culture. But even stability requires maintenance, and the demands of his career gradually introduced distance. Long shoots, international travel, and the weight of expectation strained what once felt effortless. By the time he entered the next phase of his career, the stakes were no longer personal alone. Entire productions depended on his availability. Entire franchises hinged on his presence. With success came a subtle shift. He was no longer simply participating in projects. He was carrying them. The pressure to perform, to lead, to remain physically and mentally indestructible became constant background noise. Those who worked with him during this period noticed habits that hinted at deeper tension. He trained relentlessly, sometimes beyond necessity. He filled quiet moments with activity. Creativity spilled into every corner of his life, not always in organized ways. He spoke passionately about environmental causes, oceans, preservation, and responsibility. These concerns were not performative. They reflected genuine values, but they also revealed how tightly he tied meaning to action. Doing something, anything, felt essential. Then the world slowed down. The pandemic disrupted systems built on motion. Film sets paused. Travel halted. Human connection became regulated and distant. For many, Isolation was uncomfortable. For someone whose identity relied on movement, it was destabilizing. When he tested positive and was forced into quarantine, it did not simply interrupt his schedule. It removed the very mechanisms he used to cope. Isolation arrived at a moment when his emotional foundation was already shifting. Personal relationships were under strain. Professional pressure was unrelenting. Global uncertainty filled every conversation. Stripped of routine, surrounded by silence, he faced a version of himself he rarely allowed space to exist. From the outside, none of this was visible. Public narratives remained intact. He was portrayed as resilient, optimistic, unfazed. But resilience can become a performance when vulnerability feels dangerous. The expectation to remain strong does not disappear when the cameras turn off. Often, it grows heavier. Those who knew him well understood that stillness had always been difficult. Movement had been his language. Creation his outlet. Community his anchor. Remove those elements, and what remains is exposure. Alone with thoughts that had long been drowned out by activity, he entered unfamiliar territory. This context matters because what unfolded later did not appear in isolation. It was not a sudden break from reality without cause. It was the result of years spent outrunning silence, compounded by a moment when escape was no longer possible. The mansion in London was not the beginning of the story. It was simply the place where everything he had kept in motion finally had nowhere left to go. By the time the isolation stretched beyond what anyone had expected, the shift was no longer subtle. Inside the London estate, time lost its usual shape. Days blurred together, nights grew longer, and routines that once grounded him began to dissolve. At first, the change registered only as small irregularities. Missed calls, delayed responses, conversations that drifted without clear direction. To those on the production side, it felt inconvenient. To those closer to him, it felt unsettling. During early video calls, Jason Momoa still appeared present. He spoke about recovery, reassured executives, joked with crew members. But gradually, something shifted in his demeanor. The physical discipline that had once defined him softened. His appearance grew less deliberate. Hair untrimmed, beard uneven, dark circles forming beneath eyes that no longer held the same focus. It was not dramatic enough to trigger immediate alarm, yet persistent enough to raise quiet concern. As the weeks progressed, those concerns deepened. He began requesting unusual deliveries. Large quantities of art supplies arrived at the gates. Canvases stacked against walls. Paints ordered in bulk, far beyond what a casual hobby would require. At odd hours, food orders appeared with strange combinations, untouched for hours, sometimes days. Sleep patterns fractured. Lights burned deep into the night. Security footage later showed him walking the grounds alone in the early morning darkness, gesturing as if engaged in intense conversation, though no one else was there. Inside the house, spaces began to change. Furniture was moved and rearranged repeatedly. Rooms once designed for comfort took on a different purpose. The cinema room no longer functioned as entertainment, but as a place of fixation. Documentaries played silently on a loop, images of oceans and marine life flickering endlessly across the walls. Seats were dragged into circles, notebooks left open, pages filled with dense handwriting that grew increasingly fragmented. The art that began to appear throughout the house was raw and compulsive. Walls once curated with expensive works were marked with symbols drawn in charcoal and paint. Repeating patterns emerged. Waves, trident shapes, abstract forms that suggested both movement and confinement. Floors were cleared to make space for sprawling diagrams, lines intersecting without obvious order. To an outside observer, it might have looked chaotic. To someone inside the experience, it may have felt necessary. Staff members noticed changes in his interactions as well. Requests were no longer simple or predictable. Instructions contradicted one another. Conversations jumped abruptly between topics. Moments of intense enthusiasm were followed by long silences. The man known for warmth and easy humor became harder to read. Not hostile, but distant, as if his attention was turned inward, locked on as something others could not see. When he did speak with the production team, his thoughts sometimes wandered mid-sentence. Discussions about scheduling drifted into reflections on pressure, identity, and responsibility. He spoke about the ocean with heightened urgency, about humanity's impact, about feeling trapped between who he was expected to be and who he believed himself to be. These moments passed quickly, often brushed aside with a smile, but they lingered in the minds of those listening. Isolation intensified everything. Without physical training partners, without social gatherings, without the rhythm of a working set, his coping mechanisms collapsed inward. Creativity, once a release, became obsessive. Expression turned relentless. There was no audience, no feedback, no boundary. Just repetition. The turning point came quietly, without spectacle. He left the property with little ceremony, reportedly cleared to return to filming. There was no dramatic exit, no confrontation, no public sign that anything had gone wrong. To the outside world, it appeared as though he had simply recovered and resumed work. The gates closed behind him. Silence returned. It was only after he was gone that the extent of what had occurred became visible. When the cleaning crew arrived, they expected a routine job. High-profile tenants often left behind messes. Empty bottles, disordered rooms, signs of indulgence. What they encountered felt different almost immediately. Even before stepping inside, they noticed scattered debris near the entrance. Premium alcohol bottles discarded carelessly. Magazines soaked by rain. Small details that suggested neglect rather than celebration. Inside, the house told a story that words had failed to capture. Kitchens overflowed with spoiled food. Containers from expensive restaurants sat untouched, stacked high, some still half full. Refrigerators buzzed over forgotten meals. The smell of stagnation lingered in spaces meant to feel pristine. In the living areas, the contrast was jarring. Priceless decor gave way to marked walls and disturbed floors. Rugs had been rolled back to expose patterns drawn directly on a hardwood. The designs were intricate, layered, repeated with intensity. No single room escaped alteration. Each space bore evidence of prolonged occupation without rest. The most striking transformation awaited in the private quarters. Bedrooms had become storage zones for discarded clothing, both worn and untouched, mingling without distinction. Tools lay scattered across antique furniture. Carpets bore stains no one could immediately explain. And in the bathroom, the transformation reached its most visceral form. What had once been a spa-like environment was now an improvised studio. Marble walls were covered in hand-painted murals. Ocean scenes filled the space. Creatures both recognizable and imagined swam across surfaces never meant to hold paint. The materials varied. Household paint, food coloring, coffee mixed with water. It was unpolished, emotional, urgent. Not decoration, expression. Notebooks filled every available corner. Pages were dense with thoughts, sketches, fragments of writing that spoke of exhaustion, doubt, and an overwhelming sense of pressure. The progression was visible. Early entries were coherent, reflective. Later ones unraveled, sentences breaking apart, ideas looping back on themselves. In the gym, weights had been stacked into unstable formations. Resistance bands stretched across doorways in complex patterns, creating obstacles rather than training stations. The room felt less like a place of discipline and more like a space shaped by compulsion. The cleaning crew stopped working and began documenting. Photographs were taken. Property managers were called. Lawyers contacted. This was no longer about damage. It was about responsibility and concern. What they saw did not resemble reckless partying. It resembled a private struggle that had played out unseen. Word spread quietly among those tasked with managing the aftermath. Images circulated discreetly. Reactions were muted but intense. The phrase that surfaced again and again was not scandal. It was disturbing. Not because it was sensational, but because it revealed something deeply human unfolding behind layers of privilege and control. The incident was no longer just about a delayed film or a damaged estate. It had become a question no one could easily answer. What happens when isolation strips away the structures that hold someone together, especially someone the world believes to be unbreakable? The consequences unfolded slowly, not in headlines at first, but in quiet reactions behind studio doors and private conversations that never reached the public. What had been discovered inside the estate could not be unseen. It changed how those closest to the situation interpreted the weeks of silence and irregular behavior. What once seemed like inconvenience or eccentricity now carried a different weight. The isolation had not passed through him without leaving marks. It had reshaped him, and the effects rippled outward. For Jason Momoa, returning to the set did not immediately restore normalcy. Physically, he appeared capable. He trained again, followed schedules, delivered performances. But something had shifted beneath the surface. Crew members described a subtle difference in his presence. He was still kind, still professional, yet more guarded. Moments of intensity surfaced unexpectedly, followed by long stretches of quiet withdrawal. The man who once filled every space with energy now seemed to ration it carefully. Production executives faced a different kind of reckoning. The incident forced them to confront the fragile balance between profit, pressure, and personal well-being. Delays were costly, expectations relentless. Yet what had occurred made it impossible to ignore how close everything had come to collapse. Conversations once focused solely on schedules and budgets now included mental health protocols, risk assessments, and contingency planning. Quietly, the industry took notes. The estate itself became a symbol of consequence. The property owners, accustomed to hosting powerful figures without incident, were shaken. Specialized crews were brought in to restore the house. Hazardous materials were cataloged, walls repainted, floors repaired. Some damage was cosmetic. Some felt less tangible, as though the space itself had absorbed something heavy. Insurance claims were filed. Legal teams ensured discretion. The goal was not punishment, but containment. News of the discovery circulated unevenly. It did not erupt across mainstream media immediately. Instead, it moved through private channels. Insiders spoke in lower voices. Images were shown selectively. The language used was careful. There was concern for privacy, but also unease. The story did not fit neatly into familiar categories. It was not criminal, not a scandal in the traditional sense. It was a portrait of vulnerability where invulnerability had been assumed. The psychological impact extended beyond the individual. Those who had interacted with him during isolation began replaying conversations, reinterpreting moments they had dismissed. Missed calls felt heavier in retrospect. Unusual comments took on new meaning. The realization that someone could deteriorate quietly, even while maintaining outward appearances, unsettled many. It forced a reconsideration of how warning signs are recognized and how often they are ignored. Public reaction, when fragments of the story began to surface, was divided. Some expressed concern and empathy, recognizing the toll of isolation during a global crisis. Others focused on contradictions, questioning how someone who preached responsibility could leave behind such disorder. The narrative split along familiar lines: compassion versus judgment, understanding versus skepticism. What was often lost in these debates was the complexity of the situation itself. For Momoa, the aftermath required more than cleanup. It demanded confrontation. Through representatives, he accepted responsibility for the damage, both physical and reputational. Covering costs was straightforward. Addressing the underlying issues was not. Sources later indicated that he sought professional help, not as a public gesture, but as a necessary step. Therapy sessions focused on the effects of isolation, pressure, and identity. Additional counseling addressed patterns that had emerged during those weeks alone. This process did not offer instant resolution. Recovery unfolded unevenly, marked by progress and setbacks. Those close to him described a man grappling with the realization that strength alone was not sufficient. The experience challenged long-held beliefs about resilience and control. It forced him to acknowledge limits he had previously ignored. The production he returned to also felt the consequences. New measures were introduced quietly. Single-use plastics were removed from sets. Water stations replaced bottled supplies. Sustainability protocols were tightened. On the surface, these changes aligned with values he had long championed. Beneath that alignment was a deeper motivation, the desire to reconcile actions with beliefs, to close the gap that had been exposed so painfully. Industry observers noted a shift in how mental health was discussed around major productions. The pandemic had already strained systems, but this incident personalized the risk. It was no longer abstract. It was visible. It had a name and a face recognized worldwide. Conversations that once felt optional became urgent. Preventative measures were no longer seen as indulgent, but necessary. Socially, the impact lingered. Relationships altered subtly. Trust required rebuilding, not because of betrayal, but because of fear. Those who cared about him worried quietly about recurrence. Support became more intentional. Communication more frequent. Silence was no longer taken lightly. The estate, once restored, stood again as a symbol of excess and privacy. Yet for those who had seen its transformation, it represented something else. Proof that isolation can distort even the most privileged circumstances. Evidence that mental strain does not announce itself loudly. It accumulates, spreads, and manifests in unexpected ways. The consequences of those weeks did not end with repairs or resumed filming. They extended into how decisions were made, how pressure was managed, and how vulnerability was understood. The experience left behind a question that could not be easily dismissed. If this could happen in a mansion filled with comfort, what does isolation do in places without support, without resources, without visibility? Long after the estate had been cleaned and restored, details continued to surface in fragments, not through official statements, but through memories shared quietly by those who had witnessed the situation up close. These were not dramatic revelations meant for public consumption. They were small, human observations that added weight to what had already been seen. Moments that felt insignificant at the time now carried a different meaning. One staff member recalled the way he lingered over certain objects, returning to them repeatedly as if they anchored him. A notebook left open on a table would be revisited several times a day, filled slowly, methodically, then abandoned for hours before he returned again. The pages were not linear. Thoughts circled back on themselves. Questions appeared without answers. Lines were crossed out only to be rewritten slightly differently. It suggested a mind searching for clarity and finding none. Another person remembered the silence inside the house. Not the peaceful quiet of rest, but a heavy stillness that seemed to press against the walls. Music played rarely. Television was often muted. When sound did fill the space, it was repetitive. The same ocean footage looping again and again. Waves crashing without sound. Creatures moving endlessly forward with nowhere to arrive. The repetition felt intentional, almost meditative, but also compulsive. Those who interacted with him during this period noticed moments of intense focus followed by sudden withdrawal. He could speak passionately about environmental collapse, responsibility, and legacy, then abruptly retreat, ending conversations without explanation. It was not anger. It was exhaustion. As if the weight of holding conflicting roles had finally become unbearable. Public figure, private individual, advocate, product. There were also quieter acts that rarely make headlines. He reportedly cleaned certain rooms obsessively while neglecting others entirely. Some spaces were kept pristine, almost untouched. Others deteriorated rapidly. This unevenness mirrored his internal state. Control in one area, chaos in another. It was not recklessness. It was imbalance. Friends later shared that he struggled deeply with the idea of disappointing others. The pressure to be reliable, inspiring, and unbreakable had shaped his decisions for years. Admitting vulnerability felt like failure. Even during isolation, he attempted to reassure everyone around him, downplaying his own distress. That instinct to protect others, to maintain stability, may have delayed intervention when it mattered most. What troubled some observers most was how invisible the struggle remained for so long. He continued to communicate. He continued to work remotely. He continued to present an image of recovery. There was no dramatic collapse, no emergency call that forced immediate action. The unraveling happened quietly, incrementally, in ways that are easy to overlook when expectations are high and time is scarce. Several journals recovered from the estate reportedly contained reflections on identity and purpose. Not despair in the conventional sense, but confusion. Questions about what remains when performance stops, when applause fades, when movement ceases. He wrote about feeling useful only when producing something tangible, whether a performance, a cause, or a physical achievement. Stillness, by contrast, felt like erasure. These writings also revealed an awareness of contradiction. He acknowledged the gap between his public advocacy and private behavior. The frustration was evident. He did not excuse the inconsistency. He wrestled with it. The more he tried to reconcile those opposing realities, the more trapped he seemed to feel. The conflict itself became another source of pressure. Mental health professionals who later reviewed portions of the documentation described patterns consistent with isolation-induced distress compounded by long-term stress. They emphasized that such responses are not signs of weakness, but of overload. The human mind, when deprived of structure and connection, seeks alternative outlets. Sometimes those outlets become excessive. Sometimes they become destructive. What makes these quiet stories significant is not their shock value, but their familiarity. Many people experience some version of this during periods of isolation, though without the same scale or visibility. The difference lies in resources, expectations, and scrutiny. When someone accustomed to constant validation suddenly faces silence, the impact can be profound. Those closest to him said the experience altered how he approached relationships afterward. He became more deliberate in checking in, less dismissive of fatigue, more willing to pause. The lessons were learned painfully, but they endured. He no longer treated mental strain as something to be powered through. He recognized it as something to be addressed. There were also moments of quiet creativity that survived the chaos. One mural in particular, an underwater scene painted with surprising sensitivity, was later preserved by the property owners. Art experts who viewed it suggested it held genuine emotional depth. Not polished, not commercial, honest. It stood as evidence that even during periods of distress, something meaningful had been expressed. These lesser-known details complicate the narrative. They resist easy judgment. They remind us that breakdowns do not always announce themselves with drama. Sometimes they unfold through small decisions, repeated patterns, and unspoken fears accumulating over time. What happened inside that estate was not a single event, but a convergence. Pressure, isolation, identity, expectation, silence. Together, they created conditions where even someone perceived as resilient could falter. The quieter stories do not absolve responsibility, but they provide context. They reveal the human cost beneath the spectacle. What lingered after the disruption was not the damage to walls or floors, but a deeper reckoning with what endurance truly means. For Jason Momoa, the experience reshaped the way legacy was understood, not as a collection of box office numbers or carefully curated public moments, but as the quiet imprint left by how one responds when strength is no longer performative. In the months that followed, conversations around him changed in tone. The language of pushing through gave way to the language of pacing. The mythology of invincibility softened. Those who had worked alongside him noticed a different cadence in his decisions, a willingness to slow down even when momentum demanded speed. This shift was not dramatic. It was deliberate. It reflected an understanding that longevity is not sustained by force alone, but by balance. Legacy, in this context, became less about the characters he embodied and more about the example he set afterward. He spoke openly about isolation, not as an abstract hardship, but as a condition capable of distorting perception and eroding identity. These reflections resonated beyond his immediate circle, particularly within an industry accustomed to rewarding silence over vulnerability. When someone widely associated with physical power acknowledged fragility, it disrupted expectations in a way few scripted performances ever could. The contrast between image and reality remained uncomfortable, but it also became instructive. His environmental advocacy, once viewed primarily through the lens of symbolism, took on renewed seriousness as he addressed past contradictions directly. Rather than retreat from scrutiny, he leaned into accountability. Actions replaced slogans. Systems were adjusted. Practices changed. The emphasis shifted from projection to alignment, from appearing committed to being consistent. This recalibration extended to how success itself was measured. The pursuit of constant expansion, bigger roles, greater reach, endless output began to feel less essential. Space for rest, reflection, and recalibration entered conversations that once revolved solely around opportunity. It was not a rejection of ambition, but a redefinition of it. Progress no longer meant acceleration at any cost. Observers within the industry noted how this moment contributed to a broader cultural shift already underway. The pandemic had exposed vulnerabilities across creative fields, but personal stories gave those abstractions weight. When someone with resources, access, and admiration still struggled profoundly, it challenged the assumption that privilege insulates against psychological strain. It reframed mental health as a universal concern rather than an individual failing. The idea of legacy expanded accordingly. It no longer rested only in what was produced, but in what was normalized. Acknowledging the need for support, seeking help, and integrating that reality into public discourse created space for others to do the same. The ripple effects were subtle but meaningful. Conversations changed. Expectations softened. Silence became less acceptable as a default response to distress. There is also an acknowledgement of grief, not in the traditional sense of loss through death, but the mourning of a former self. The version that could outrun discomfort through sheer activity no longer existed. In its place emerged someone more aware of limits, more attentive to warning signs, and more willing to adapt. This evolution carried its own form of sadness, but also relief. Letting go of invulnerability allowed room for sustainability. The estate in London, once a backdrop for isolation, became an unintended marker in that transition. Its restoration mirrored an internal process, layers removed, damage addressed, surfaces renewed. Yet the experience left a trace that could not be erased, only integrated. It served as a reminder that environments shape behavior, and that even the most luxurious settings cannot replace human connection. Looking forward, the narrative resisted closure. There was no neat ending, no definitive lesson that resolved every contradiction. Instead, there was continuity, ongoing effort, an understanding that mental health is not a milestone reached once, but a condition maintained over time. The work did not end with acknowledgement. It continued through daily choices, boundaries, and recalibrations. What ultimately remained was a question that extended beyond one individual. How do we define strength in a world that demands constant visibility and productivity? What does responsibility look like when the pressure to perform collides with the need to rest? And how many struggles remain unseen simply because they unfold behind walls designed to keep everything else out? These reflections did not diminish achievement. They contextualized it. They suggested that legacy is not only what is built, but what is preserved. Not only the impact made outwardly, but the care taken inwardly. In recognizing that balance, the story moved beyond spectacle and into something quieter, more enduring.